Excellent. Well, welcome to this event today titled Mapping Learning to Earning Pathways. So my name is Marie Gardner, and I'm the Executive Director of the International Initiative for Impact Evaluation, 3IE, and you'll hear a bit more about who we are later. But foremost, 3IE has been working with FCDO since February this year on a project, a very exciting one that aims to understand what works in the technical and vocational education and training and skills space. Shorthand for that is TVET space, so that you're ready for that acronym for later on in the event. Our project with FCDO has 3 stages, of which we are presenting stage 1 today. We, or rather Jem, Anil, and several of our 3IE team have produced a framework and a scoping paper report for TVET interventions and labor market outcomes. So really welcome again to taking time out for this important event, and which is a formal and a sort of a public launch of this report. The main aim of today's session is to present this framework and for you all to provide feedback on it. We're using this as an opportunity for inputs to ensure that stages 2 and 3, which are sort of the next stages, so producing an evidence gap map and also a best buys report. So to ensure that these are produced in ways which are useful to the sector. This is, by the way, I believe the 4th dissemination step we are taking. 2 weeks ago, we held 3 roundtable, or we, the team rather, held 3 roundtable sessions with a select number of participants who provided really in-depth feedback. And actually really excitingly also, we will be publishing a blog tomorrow, which outlines sort of some of the key points that came out of the discussions that we had and the feedback provided. I would like to take the opportunity right up front to thank Nikki Stoddart, who is one of the Deputy Directors on Education in FCDO, and Phoebe Hill, who's the lead on higher education and skills from FCDO, who you will also hear from later in this event, as well as Callum, who is, I believe, unable to join us today, but who the team has also really appreciated working with. And I believe later in the event, we're also thrilled to actually have Simon McNaughton, the acting director of RED, the research department at FCDO, will also be joining us as he's with Anil and I. We are in Cape Town exactly for an event around synthesis. So that's quite exciting. Also, thanks are due to those who contributed to the report as part of this of the advisory group that we had, and also those who have provided inputs in these roundtable sessions that I mentioned. Let me just take a moment to set the stage for why this sort of project is needed. Why is it important? And the thing is that finding out what works, sort of what are cost-effective investments, and using this information to inform investment decisions, programming decisions, this should be a no-brainer, right? Yet, all too often, such evidence is not used or not used well because it is not readily available, because the incentives to use it are not there, because incentives to approve, disperse, implement tend to override all other incentives in development organizations. And there are other reasons as well, but these are some of the main reasons why it's not used sufficiently. But using good evidence, high quality evidence, has actually never been more important than now. The world as a whole and the funding landscape for development work has really dramatically shifted in 2025. And so we have less funding for development, are increasingly exposed to disinformation dressed up as evidence. And so now more than ever, it is really vital that resources are used effectively and informed by credible evidence. So understanding what works, how, for whom, at what cost, by examining the evidence we currently have access to is, really a really excellent first step to ensuring that investments are made in the right areas. And so that's what this is all about. And with that, I'm happy to hand over to Nikki for your opening remarks. Thank you, everyone.
Good afternoon, everyone, and huge thanks to Marie for that thoughtful introduction and for setting the stage so clearly. And thank you to all of you for joining us today, whichever part of the sector you're tuning in from. Your time, your insights, and your future collaboration with us are deeply appreciated. So as Marie has outlined, we're here today to discuss the first output from the FCDO and 3IE's TVET and Skills Evidence Synthesis project, a project born from a shared cross-sector recognition that while there is a growing body of evidence on learning to earning transitions, it has often been fragmented, hard to navigate, and difficult to apply in practice. So this work is essentially our collective response to that challenge. 3IE's flexibility, their technical expertise, and their deep commitment to evidence-informed development has been invaluable. Together, we've built a framework that doesn't just reflect one organisation's view, but instead aims to capture the full diversity of interventions and outcomes shaping TVET and skills development across low and middle income countries. But we very much see this as just the beginning. The strength of this work will depend on the breadth of voices that shape it. And that's why we're committed to making this process as open and inclusive as possible. We've already seen exceptional engagement across the sector, both during and since the publication of this first output, and we want to build on that momentum. We welcome challenge and we welcome critique, because we know that the more perspectives we bring in, the stronger and more relevant this work will become, helping us ensure that every pound spent on the learning to earning transition delivers the greatest possible impact. So thank you again for being here. We look forward to your questions, your feedback, and your continued partnership as we move into the next phases of this important work. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you to Marie and Nikki for those opening remarks. I am now going to run through our presentation. So for the next 20 minutes, I'm going to be doing a lot of talking, but really here, I'm going to delve into what we've worked on so far, what our next steps are, and how we'd really like everybody's inputs. Like Nikki was saying, this is really an open conversation. That's something we're really keen to have. I am Yavuz, Senior Research Associate at 3IE. We're also joined today by Anil Forta and Abdulrahman Negi, both with 3IE, who will also be joining in the end at the Q&A session. So, okay, perfect. My PowerPoint is working. So really briefly, a little bit about 3IE for those who do not know us. So we are, apologies, I just need to move that little widget. 3IE is an international NGO. We're dedicated to using evidence to transform people's lives in low and middle income countries. We have offices in DC, London, New Delhi, and a West African secretariat. We work closely with governments such as FCDO, as well as other institutions like foundations. We produce both synthesis work, which is where we're coming to you today from, as well as impact evaluations. And one of the really key aspects and part of the entire reason we're having this discussion today is that all of our outputs are global public goods. And so, like I said, in terms of 3IE's architecture, we're really coming to you today from the Synthesis and Reviews Office. So what this project is about, it's not about generating new evidence at this stage, rather it's about understanding what we can learn from the evidence that has already been produced and already exists and how that can inform different investment decisions. And so an overview of the project. I think Nikki really covered the main points here about how did this project come to be. So like Marie noted, we've been working with FCDO since February on this. We've just produced our first output, which is the publication of a framework and scoping paper I know that paper is going to be dropped into the chat at some point so everybody can access it. And really, this came to be because current evidence is unclear and difficult to navigate. The idea here is to support cost-effective, evidence-informed decisions. And really, we want to work towards understanding best buys. What are those interventions which give us the greatest impact at the best costs? And so outside of that, there's also some other points really here. One aspect of this that we can't overlook is the way that TVET and skills programs sort of interact with foundational education and education agendas. And one of the aspects here is that TVET and skills can often be overlooked, but in a lot of cases, the effectiveness of TVET and skills programs can be based on the success of foundational skills. People do often need foundational skills to be effective TVET participants. Another really key aspect that this project will help solve is that skills outcomes are a lot harder to define and capture than traditional education metrics. So one step that we will be going through in this project, stage 2, and I'll explain that in a minute, looks at what outcomes are being measured in the evidence. This is a really simple first step to understanding and standardizing outcomes so that we can compare the effectiveness of programs across different contexts. And so in terms of some statistics, in 2025, 12.5% of youth are projected to be unemployed. We are off track to meet SDG 8.6.1, which is about getting youth into work. More importantly, 2/3 of not in employment, education, or training youth are women. And even in contexts where women have rising education rates, specifically in the Middle East and North Africa, where women are actually graduating university in some cases at a higher rate than men, that's not having a particular difference on their labour market entry, where it's remained stagnant. We also know that this is an area that looks to be underfunded. So when comparing the funding within governments on TVET, low and middle income countries are funding and making these investments at a much lower rate than high income countries. And while it is very difficult to confirm a sustained downward trend in funding using global figures, we know that resources are limited. And like Marie said at the beginning, when resources are limited, it's imperative that we use what is available effectively. Rigorous evidence, synthesizing and understanding what works is a first step towards doing that. And so in general, we have 3 aims for this project. We want to inform policy and evidence programs, help guide decisions, and promote the best possible youth labour market outcomes. So our project is a 3-phase project. Today, we are disseminating and discussing phase 1. So what we have been doing since February is creating a framework, and this framework is the foundation for the subsequent phases. So it's really important that we get this right, otherwise the second and third phase won't be as effective. When we talk about a framework, what we are referring to is a matrix defining programs or interventions, so specific policies and projects, and outcomes. This is what we at 3A use in our evidence gap maps, which is phase 2. And I think in the chat, we might also drop in an EGM so you guys can see what that will actually look like. But phase 1 has been about understanding what sort of programs are happening in low and middle income countries and what outcomes are being measured. So we've taken a lot of steps to make sure that this is as thorough as possible. So during the original creation of the framework, we formed a technical advisory group covering all regions across the world to help and provide inputs. Then with our publication, we have now gone through, and this is our 4th dissemination round. So we've had a number of different discussions with experts and stakeholders across different regions, making sure that this is capturing what is actually happening. And this is where we come today. the final dissemination phase, a final chance for us to get the inputs that we need to make sure we have the foundations for phase 2 and 3. And so phase 2, which is the evidence gap map, is about understanding what evidence exists. At that point, we're not looking to answer what works, what's cost effective. Rather, we're looking what evidence exists and what evidence does not exist. Are there gaps in knowledge which we might need to fund to have answers to? But specifically, where we know what evidence exists, we can then go into phase 3, which is where we answer what works. And this is where we're looking at what interventions are effective and at what cost. Are specific programs more cost effective than others? As well as just looking at impact, at this point, we also look at why something works. So it's not just about quantitative impact, but it's also about looking at the qualitative literature to understand whether a certain implementation program, are there different impacts on the effectiveness of programs? So here we really try to look at both the quantitative impact, the way programs are being implemented, and the cost effectiveness. And that will be our third phase. So I'm now going to go through our framework. This is run through at a slightly higher level than is reported in our publication. So if you go to the publication, you can see exactly the specific interventions and how we define them. What that means is, as I'm running through it right now, there might be something that you think I've missed. It might well be the case that we've missed it and it's something that we need to incorporate. It might also be the case that it's defined based on the very specific interventions we have in the fuller report. So we have here 5 intervention groups and 6 outcome groups, and these are all related to technical and vocational and education and training skills programs. What we focus on here is supply side interventions. So this is a really important distinction. In the conversations we've had around gaining inputs into this framework, there have been a lot of discussions about how do we bring the demand side in. So what we mean here is we're looking at interventions that supply people with the skills needed to enter employment, supply side. We're not looking for interventions that necessarily create employment opportunities, the demand side. That doesn't mean that we are not looking at interventions which might interact with the demand side, and we have some really specific examples that I'll provide. But one of the things that has really come out of conversations is, while we're not going to be looking specifically at demand side interventions, how do we make sure we do incorporate it somehow? Because it's important. Without knowing the demand side picture, we don't have a full picture. But here, like I said, we're focusing on supply side, and that will come through in our intervention groups. So I'm going to run through these now. Again, if you want to look at them in greater detail, please go into our publication. You'll see the full list there. So when we were creating this framework, when we thought about the interventions, we almost had a narrative to which we were working with. If we think about somebody wanting to gain the skills needed to enter employment, if they want to join a TVET course, in the first place, that course has to be available to them. Availability is our first intervention group, and we have 2 intervention categories here. So these are interventions that aim to increase the number of programs on offer to people. This is split between those that are offered as part of the formal education environment and those which are provided via the private sector. Formal education development could be something like incorporating TVET skills into a school curriculum. Private sector development would be things like incentives to the private sector to create courses and to take on apprenticeships, things like that. So the first step to delivering skills is to make the courses available. Once they are available, there might still be barriers that prevent people from accessing the courses. This is our second group, access. Here it's about interventions which look to overcome the barriers that prevent people from pursuing TVET courses. So the first intervention category is financial and in-kind support. This looks to overcome the financial barrier, providing people with subsidies or cash so they can enroll on TVET courses. The second one is about the social barriers that somebody might face, so awareness programs to counter social norms and biases. And here there's really two main biases we're thinking about. So the first, in a lot of contexts, there's just a general bias against TVET programs. It's the idea that people who go into TVET programs are those who have failed as part of the formal educations. It's a backup, effectively. And so programs which try to counter that bias and promote TVET programs can be incorporated here. There's also the gender aspect. So any barriers that women might face in terms of social norms about them entering TVET, any program which seeks to overcome those are also incorporated here. And so at this stage, the TVET course is available and accessible. We now have a set of interventions which are about making sure that when it's delivered in a way that's going to be effective. So the quality group is about that, making sure that TVET delivery is effective. The first category we have here is systemic capacity strengthening. And this is really one of the main categories where we talk about that demand-side interaction. So here, we're thinking about ways in which TVET curricula, the skills that are being provided on courses, can be matched to those that are needed in the job market. So this would be things like updating TVET curricula, job skills matching, other programs which are just about making sure that the system is delivering it effectively. We then have the education and trainer delivery strengthening. So this is teacher training programs, giving those people who are delivering TVET courses the skills they need in order to deliver it effectively. We then have vocation information. So providing people who are going to join a TVET course with the information they need in order to make an informed decision. For instance, providing people upfront with the potential salaries that they could expect from joining a specific vocation. And then the final category is guidance services. So things like counseling and mentorship, connecting TVET participants with experienced professionals to support their development. So at this stage, TVET is available, accessible, and hopefully being implemented in a way that is effective. It's now being delivered. So this is our group, which is really classic TVET programs. One thing that we experienced when creating this framework is that it was very apparent, though there are terminologies used within the sector, the key one here being apprenticeships, they do not mean the same thing in different contexts. And so when we created this group, rather than using the terminology, which does not stay consistent across different contexts, we decided to look at the components within those terms. So for instance, what actually makes up an apprenticeship? And so here we have 4 categories. The first is technical vocational education and training, and this is just the education component. Importantly here, you'll see in the report we've split this between the formal and non-formal environments, so we're capturing them in their different settings, but this is purely about delivering people education on vocations. That is separate to the category on-the-job training. So if a program was just to provide skills on the job to somebody, that would be captured there. And then you have TVET and on-the-job training, and this is classically what we would consider an apprenticeship, a combination of formal education around a vocation as well as on-the-job training. Finally, we also have core skills training. So this is defined based on the ILO framework that came out a few years ago. And this is not about delivering people the skills they need for a specific vocation. Rather, it's about core skills that they need in general employment. So we can think here things like cognitive and metacognitive skills. This is where we would also capture things like entrepreneurship training. So any program that's delivering people the sort of business skills they need to set up and start their own business. And so at this point, TVET has been delivered, but there are also additional barriers that might prevent somebody from engaging in employment. And there are some supplementary interventions that aim to just overcome that last barrier. And so the first category we have here is certification. So programs that certify a job seeker's skills. And you know, these are not formal education certification. It's about those other skills that maybe you gained as part of a core skills program. We also have job matching, so programs which match a person's skills with a specific job opportunity, and job searching training, so any program which is seeking to help somebody understand how to navigate the labour market, search across different job posting websites, that sort of thing. And so that is our intervention framework. In terms of the outcome framework, you'll see at the beginning, it looks kind of similar. So when we are looking at interventions which seek to increase the number of programs available, we'll also measure that as an outcome. So availability is our first outcome group. Here we have two really simple measures, the number of TVET opportunities and the number of on-the-job training opportunities that are made available to people. We then have access, so aspirations are people looking to seek employment in a certain sector. Gender norms, maybe this could be something around parents' views of their daughter entering a certain vocation. And then finally, simply participation in TVET, the number of TVET participants. We then have quality. So any measure of an institution's quality and its capacity to deliver TVET effectively. Any assessment of an educator or trainer's skills in delivering TVET. We also have retention of an educator or trainer. Completion. So in the last group, we have TVET participation. That's simply whether somebody enrolls in a course. Here we have completion, so do people actually graduate from their course? And then employment sector. So if a TVET participant is being trained in a certain vocation, when they go on into employment, are they actually employed in that vocation, or is it something different? We then have skills and education outcomes. So any measure of somebody's knowledge and possession of a skill, as well as whether they adopt and utilize that skill. Knowledge diffusion, so are skills and knowledge being diffused within the workplace. Job searching and seeking behaviors, so any measure related to the number of jobs somebody might have applied to, for instance. And formal education outcomes, so if a study was also to measure something like university graduation, we would capture that here. We then have really what are the main outcomes we're interested in, and these are the labour market outcomes. And these are measured at either the individual or household level. So the first is job transition time. How long does it take somebody to move into employment? We then have wage employment, so is somebody employed? Different measures of job quality, job satisfaction. We then have income and savings and asset ownership as measures of economic outcomes. So while these labour market outcomes are measured at the individual or household level, we also have business outcomes. And these are split between two different sorts of businesses. So the first relates specifically for businesses set up by individuals who participated in a TVET course. So for instance, if somebody went through an entrepreneurship course and then decided to set up their own business, these would be outcomes measured for that business. So things like business ownership, business performance. These are separate to outcomes for the training firms. So if you are a business who has provided on-the-job training, these are the outcomes measured for you. So really, these outcomes capture the benefits of being a business to offer apprenticeships, to offer on-the-job opportunities. And so here we have things like firm employment, employment creation, firm profit retention, and employment performance. And that is the interventions outcome framework that we have. There are also some other aspects that are really key to this sector, which we want to capture and we want to understand, but that are not specifically related to an intervention or an outcome. And these are what we call our cross-cutting themes. And so if any of you have ever used a 3AE evidence gap map before, you'll know that there are lots of different filters at the top of the map. You can use the filters to understand the evidence base by looking at different variables. These are so far some of the cross-cutting themes that have come up, ideas for different ways we should explore the evidence base. So the first one is population targeted. For instance, is the intervention targeted towards women, persons with disabilities, conflict-affected people? We then have the content of the intervention. So for instance, if it's a TVET course, is it maybe focused on green skills? Is it focused on STEM? What is the specific vocation that the course is focused on? The length of intervention, so is it a shorter course, maybe 6 months or less? Is it a longer course, 2 years, for instance? And then nowadays, as so many of these are also delivered online, the intervention delivery method. So is this a course delivered online? Is it delivered in person? And those are our cross-cutting themes. Definitely, this is one area where we're looking to capture and understand exactly what would be useful for the sector when you're exploring the evidence. What are those aspects you're really interested in? And so we'd definitely be really interested to hear your thoughts in the Q&A section at the end on this. And so what's the policy relevance and use of this project? Why are we doing it? And so I think we've already touched on a lot of these points. The general idea is to support evidence-informed decisions. We want to identify which interventions are effective and offer greatest value for money. Just the mapping of studies against the different outcome measures used is a really great first step in addressing the gap in standardized outcomes for TVET. And so in general, this project is a step towards guiding smarter, better targeted investments in youth skills and employment. And while phase 1, 2, and 3 are what we are currently working on, that's not necessarily where we see this project ending. So here we have 4, 5, and 6. These are different potential phases beyond phase 3. So phase 4, an impact evaluation program. When we are producing the evidence gap map, we're going to be able to see which areas we just don't have any evidence on. We don't know if this works or not because the evaluations have not been produced. And so a program which looks to fund and produce the evidence in those gaps would be a really great next step. A lot of this evidence is global, it's across different contexts. A potential phase 5 could look at taking this sort of global evidence base and contextualizing this evidence to specific countries to support local level recommendations. And so this would be a process which involves understanding the specific challenges of TVET in countries and looking at what we can learn from the global evidence base to overcome those challenges. And then phase 6 is living synthesis. So when we produce the evidence gap map, that will be produced at one point in time. Obviously, every month there are so many different publications and evaluations that are coming to light. And so to ensure that stakeholders have access to the most up-to-date evidence, it's really important that we update this work, we keep it going so that people keep having the access to what they need. And so in terms of next steps for the project, this is pretty much the culmination, the launch of phase 1. Soon we should be moving into phase 2. Like I said, like was said in the beginning, we really view this as something that is open. This isn't something that is owned by FCDO or 3A. We want this to be something that works for the entire sector. And so while we're moving into phase 2 and 3, we will have similar sessions to this, many different opportunities for your inputs to be added. So please look out for those. We'll be absolutely sure to send follow-ups to every participant here while we are going into these next stages, and we just want to continue having this open conversation with the sector. And so with that, I will stop talking for the moment. I think we'll move into the Q&A and discussion now. So what I will do is quickly put these questions up and pose them to you guys. We'll drop these in the chat as well so you can see them. But these are the sort of things we're really interested in understanding. So which interventions and outcomes matter most in your context? Where is TVET evidence strongest or most urgently needed? How can this work be helpful to decision makers? What can we do to make sure the outputs of phase 2 and phase 3 are useful and relevant? And so, as well as this, we've got a wonderful bunch of panelists who are ready to answer any questions you might have about this work. I'm going to stop sharing my screen for the moment so I can just see everybody, and then that will just be a lot more useful for me. So I don't know, Sawa, if we have any questions to kick things off with.
Yes, well, we are waiting for more questions. There are currently 2 questions in the chat, so I'll just read it out. So the first question is from Jude Abro, an impact assessment economist at the International Center of Insect Physiology and Ecology based in Nairobi. Zudu is wondering if there are cost-effective scaling mechanisms from TVET interventions that could be applied to promote innovations in food systems, particularly in the African context.
Thank you. And so I think this is a question that I'll leave open to anyone who might want to tackle it. I'll quickly give my 2 thoughts on it. I think that's a question that we don't have the answer to right now, just because we are currently in the scoping and framework phase. I think that's something that maybe we could try to answer later down the line when we know what evidence exists. I don't think food systems has necessarily been at the forefront of our minds while developing this framework. I think we've definitely been looking at labor market outcomes predominantly, but I don't know if anybody else on the panel has anything they might want to add on that at all.
I would probably just add, not that I'm the expert on this, that like given the way that the framework has been produced to kind of focus on the supply side rather than the demand side, we haven't focused on particular like priority sectors so much, which is why we can't answer this question right now. But it's definitely something that a future phase, I imagine, will probably also look at the demand side and about the kind of I think context, like local, as Jem mentioned earlier, local context is really important here. So where we're talking about kind of country context and like continent focused work, that will probably be the point where we delve down to more demand side. But thank you for your question.
Thank you so much, Phoebe, and thanks so much, everyone. So now moving on to the next question, but actually it's also somewhat related to the cost-related question. So Elena Walls is wondering what the team is proposing to do to address this cost evidence gap.
So I will again open this up to anyone on the panel. I don't know if anybody has particular experience in trying to work with cost evidence. I think though we haven't searched for the evidence yet, we are anticipating that there's probably not going to be loads of evidence focusing on cost effectiveness. And that's mainly from my experience working on this sort of project across a lot of different sectors. Anil?
Yeah. Sorry about that. I hope you can hear me okay. So yes, cost information this is a very broad overview, right, as a very sort of first step to sort of set the framework. So if you go to phase 2, for instance, and we do an evidence and gap map, then just the cost information across any of these interventions would be sort of like a cross-cutting theme that we would collect on. Just with the caveat that cost information or cost effectiveness information is quite sparse across sectors, across the literature. It's just the way it is. We do get it, but we will, when we do the phase 2, we'll collect it. And then when we then go to the smart buys, that'll focus on one type of TVET or 2 types of TVET interventions. There we'll actually look at it in more detail. So that's when we will sort of get to that information, but with the sort of cautious optimism that economic or cost information is often not very frequently available. Thank you.
Thanks, Anil, and thanks, everyone. Moving on to the next question. So from Ibrahim Al-Jabari, the question is, which low and middle incomes are the focus? If there is any contextual variations, if we can elaborate on conflict-affected countries.
I'm happy to take this one quickly. I think so. No specific focus in terms of low middle income countries. We will look at any lower middle income country. One of the things we want to do, and that you'll be able to use when we produce the evidence gap map, is look at whether there are regional variations in the effectiveness of TVET. Is particular TVET programs more effective in sub-Saharan Africa than South Asia? If we have the available evidence, that's the sort of analysis we would love to complete so we can understand that regional variation. And again, looking at conflict affected, I think that's one of the cross-cutting themes we would really like to bring in to see what's actually being measured in those settings. Phoebe?
Thanks, Jem. And yeah, just to add to this from a kind of FCDO skills journey perspective on this, when we first started delving into the kind of skills evidence base, we have in our kind of internal research analysts cadre, we were kind of shown the initial evidence or the kind of sparse evidence that existed, and there is already kind of quite a lot of regional variation in effectiveness. So I think we know that there's pockets of interventions in Southeast Asia that have like really strong effectiveness, but that wouldn't necessarily have translated to sub-Saharan Africa or Latin America. So some of that evidence already exists. So this will be about kind of pulling that out and trying to synthesize it better, and also increase where there's kind of lacking or patchy evidence, because like we said, there's some areas like already really strong evidence on effectiveness, but not consistent across all countries or all parts of the world. Thanks.
AR?
Yeah, very quickly, just I would like to stress a lot about your point about if we can find evidence related to conflicted areas, because again, it's very possible that we'll find very limited evidence related or like basically generated from affected areas. But one good thing about evidence gap maps, it can highlight also the gaps, and the gaps here could also gaps related to like areas where we might need to generate more evidence to certain group or certain context, basically be better informed this decision later stage. So again, what we are doing for systematic review is looking into what is evidence generated and classifying them between what is working, what's not working, and what are basically the areas where we need to do more research and evidence on it.
Thank you so much for your answers. Yes, sorry, Anil.
Just to reiterate what's already been said, I think with the fragile settings and context is a sort of common filter that we have in all of the maps that we do. So we can pull out the information from that. And just like AR said, it could be a gap that we find, but it could be a gap in certain settings. Certain settings may still have some studies. So we can also break it down by region and by country. So all of that information is standard in any 3IE evidence and gap map. So you can pull out the evidence in the context that you want, and then there will be additional context that makes sense for TVET as filters. So you can filter out from the overall evidence and say, okay, I'm interested in this region for this populations in these kinds of settings, and you can find the studies that are relevant to that, or you can find that there are no studies that need impact evaluations.
Thank you so much. Now we'll move on to the next question. So from Lucian Lee, the question is how the audience can engage with the team further in this work as they anticipate we are producing more data and evidence in the coming months. So if there is any plan, whether they can engage further on this work.
AR?
Yeah, I can take this very quickly. So simply, please, we would really appreciate and love if you have any information, any data and evidence, just reach out to us, share them with us. We would really appreciate this, and we really value this kind of contribution and enthusiasm about this kind of work. However, one thing that we would like to ensure is that as Jem and Danielle and everyone said here, we have 3 stages out of this work. So what we are doing now is basically concluding the first stage, which was basically developing the framework for the evidence synthesis around the TVET. But after each stage, we are hoping also to ensure that we are sharing and disseminating our learnings out of each stage, which again, during this process, please, for you and for everyone else who will basically be interested in sharing the information, data, evidence, or spotting a light on a certain aspect that you think are valuable, we would really appreciate and value this. Thank you so much.
And if I could just add from the FCDO perspective as well, we have an internal resource that we call our Centre of Expertise for Education that includes kind of a knowledge base for skills research. So if any of your organisations are producing kind of high quality data and evidence, please do reach out, because we have a central repository where we keep all of this evidence, and we kind of use it, or our colleagues at Post, so in our embassies, use it to inform the governments that they're working with when they give technical advice on education. So we really welcome data and evidence in whatever shape we can take it on board. So yeah, please do reach out. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you, Phoebe and AR, on your answer. We have still quite some questions, so I'll go through. Another question is, if it's to them, if you can give the audience a bit more details on the rationale behind choosing supply-side interventions, the decision that we made to focus on this.
Yeah, and I think it's quite a quick answer in that was the resources that we had available to us. We couldn't expand the scope of this project to include both supply and demand side interventions. We saw the focus on supply side, so that's what we've chosen to focus on in the first instance. And so like we said, we would really love to do this exact exercise for the demand side, and hopefully that's something we can do one day. And we do think that once this is done for both the supply and the demand side, we'll have a really wonderful, fuller picture of what's going on. But purely as a resource focus, we're starting with the supply side. AR?
No, just I would like to stress again what you said, and clearly for all evidence synthesis, we usually need to set up a boundaries for what we include and what we exclude, right? Because otherwise we will take years and years just synthesizing everything, which also could be sometimes not very efficient. However, we really appreciate and would love, as Jem said, to do the same exact exercise on different sides on the supply as well as demand, and even expand this for other related topics and sectors.
Sawa, sorry, I just noticed there's a really interesting question that seems to have gone into the answered part.
Yeah, sure.
I
think you can point it out and you can go ahead with answering.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting question. It's one that came up a lot in our roundtable. So the question was, how can the evidence support the fact that TVET investments are cost effective but need access to funding? In a lot of countries, public universities get most of the education funding, leaving little to not much funding to TVETs. In addition, still in a lot of contexts, TVET is undervalued in a large part because they're not aligning with labour market demands or the system itself is fragmented. And so I can quickly touch on a discussion we had last week on this point, and I think I'd really love to hear FCDO's perspective on this, especially around the sort of funding going to foundational education via TVET. But one of the things that came up last week and really struck me is that answering this sort of question is what's really important about our outputs. And so, like I said, one of our outcome groups is focused on business outcomes for those who are providing TVET. And I think that's really important because we know, we've heard from multiple people now, that a lot of businesses just aren't that into TVET, not willing to take on apprenticeships. There's not that engagement from the private sector. So if we go through this process and we find out, and of course we don't know what the evidence will say, but if the evidence says, look, taking on apprenticeships, taking part in TVET programs can lead to really great business outcomes, that's a really impactful use case for this work. What can we do in terms of producing the output to help support this issue where the private sector is not engaging? And so what we want to do in practical terms is when we are looking at programs, when we are looking at studies, we want to capture to what extent they have engaged with the private sector. So was the TVET curriculum developed with the private sector? Did it use skills matching to make sure the skills that were provided would match local job markets? Then, again, if the evidence allows, let's look at the differing impact of programs where they did engage with the private sector v where they didn't. Then we might be able to say, look, engaging with the private sector does lead to more effective outcomes. We are really looking at how we can address this, and I think it's a really fundamental part of the output. Really interested though on FCDO's side, if there's anything you guys want to add on this.
Yeah, I'm happy to kind of tell our perspective on it because it's been a little bit of a journey. And so the UK or the FCDO, or formerly DFID, has spent the majority of its education budget focused on foundational learning, because I think there was a sense that the evidence base was really strong there, and also, like you say, a lot of governments spend most of their public education budget on universities, so it felt like there was more of a role for donors to play to top that up in a foundational space. The UK's approach is not the approach that everyone takes, though we do know other donor countries that spend more of their money on skills and TVET, and often it can be a political choice. I think what I would say, so on the journey that we've taken, we had a large centrally managed program on skills called Skills for Prosperity that ran from 2019 to 2023. It was in 9 different countries across 3 different continents. We found that the governments we worked with were kind of also very focused on universities. So we were trying to talk to them about TVET as not just a kind of university side product, but also something that can bridge foundational learning and tertiary education, essentially. And I don't think we've not totally answered that question. And I think one of the reasons why donors sometimes shy away from investing is because of the fragmentation of the system and the fact that we don't, the UK itself has not cracked skills education either. We've had lots of different qualifications. So foundational learning is the best part is a much more understood. So I think in terms of donors feeling nervous about where they spend their money, foundational is often felt as more of a safe bet. But we all kind of understand that there is foundational learning without smooth transition to the job market or even higher education. In the case of women in MENA, without transition to the job market, won't translate into the growth that all countries are looking for. So we're trying to kind of address that balance and recognize what countries are trying to achieve, and kind of suggest that education funding should be directed towards TVET where it's appropriate. I think I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Phoebe, and thanks for also them sharing your thoughts. And now I will move on to the next question from Jenny Price. it might be out of scope of this research, but curious about whether this report provides any insights around the key funders, implementers, or organizations working in or influencing the TVET space, their key priorities and how they are aligned or not in their approaches and priorities.
So my quick reaction to that is certainly part of that is well within the scope of what we are going to look at. So when we are doing the second phase, looking at the evidence that exists, one of the things we will be mapping is who are the implementers of these programs, who funded these programs, as well as who funded the evaluation. So we'll certainly capture that and be able to sort of provide a picture around who the implementers and funders are. In terms of looking at sort of the priorities of different key players in the space, I think that probably verges a little more outside of the scope of what we would be looking at. But again, we're having a conversation at this stage and we're really open to what would be interesting and relevant to the sector. So if this is something that comes out as a focus point, then again, we're very, very open to including it. Phoebe.
Thanks, Jim. And yeah, just to add on that. So I think this is probably out of the scope of this paper, certainly, but it's a question that we were also we had also when we started this work. And I think just anecdotally, something we found along the way is that the reason why we think this framework is so important is in the kind of stakeholder engagement we've done with key donors and players in this space, is that we don't all think the same way. We don't even always share the same vocabulary on kind of outputs, outcomes, and we don't always share the same view on evidence even. There are kind of key donors and stakeholders who feel more confident on the evidence base and are kind of going ahead with larger programming, and there are some countries that are kind of holding back until they feel more confident on best buys. So it's certainly something that I would find really useful, and that I don't think we have an answer to yet, but I definitely can assure you that we don't all kind of agree or think the same way on skills. So that's just my experience of it anyway.
Thanks, Phoebe. Also, thanks, Sam. So the next question is from Gilda Sanchez. Did you find any particular trend in the evidence gaps and interventions in Latin America? And also, were there any gaps linked to gender barriers? And while I assume that we will figure this out in the next phase during the evidence gap map phase, but maybe we can share some reflections on gaps you know, or some issues around, for instance, gender barriers.
I think that would be one I'd pass over to the FCDO team if you have anything to add there. I would say I completely agree with you, Sarah. That is probably a question that we would answer when doing this conversation at the end of phase 2. We should hopefully be able to have the answers to that question in terms of the trends and gaps.
Yeah, and I was just going to add this. I don't think this has come up as part of this framework. We've done skills programming in Latin America in the past, I think in Brazil and Mexico. And I think I'd be, as part of the kind of dissemination of this, I'd be happy to share some evaluations we had on those projects. Because I think we did look at gender barriers and also kind of barriers for Indigenous women also in Latin America. It was something that I remember coming up a lot when we were closing the program in 22, 23. But I don't think we've looked at it specifically for this piece of research.
Yes, thank you. The next question is from Ananya Samajda. Any evidence expected on strategies for localized employment of trainees vis-a-vis migration-based employment?
So I think if I'm understanding the question correctly, that is potentially something that could be a cross-cutting theme. I'm trying to envisage how that would sort of be merged into the outcome framework. It's definitely not something we've actually had come up in our previous conversations. I don't think anybody has sort of highlighted the idea of looking at different labour market outcomes based on localised or migrated employment. But I think it's something that we can consider as a cross-cutting theme to explore. I don't know if anybody else on the panel has anything to add on that one.
All right, great. Thank you. So we'll move on to the next question. So the question from Gordon Chan: many employment outcomes depend on factors outside of skills development. For instance, economic conditions, social networks. How will the review take these additional dimensions into account, if you will?
I would love to pass that over to Anil or AR, maybe to discuss the focus of impact evaluations and why we would look at those to sort of understand the direct impact of an intervention as opposed to.
Yes,
Sure,
Anil?
I can start and then hand over to AR. I think, yeah, that is always a difficult thing to figure out, right? Usually when we're looking at impact evaluations in a systematic review, you only know what is reported there, and it's sort of usually focused on that intervention and how they evaluated it. But these days we sort of approach a more mixed methods synthesis for systematic reviews. So that will also include including qualitative studies or qualitative information from studies. So as long as those studies are reporting that, like, these were the, say, economic conditions or political conditions, they may not report it, in which case it becomes even more challenging. But if we do have that information, then we can incorporate that in some way. And then the synthesis comes from a triangulation of that qualitative information along with any quantitative information or meta-analysis that we do. So the effort will be there. It'll be in our protocol and it'll be placed publicly, and people can provide their feedback on that. But again, it depends on whether that information is reasonably available in the literature. So we will be bound by that. Thank you.
Yeah, very, very quickly, I agree with this. As someone who I do randomized controlled trials, and I understand completely that we focus on randomized controlled trials that focus on a certain outcomes, and basically it sometimes just hard to understand the context behind and beyond a single randomized controlled trial. But as Anil mentioned, including qualitative reports as well as looking into gray literature, like some reports coming from the government or from other institutions, can really help, and sometimes in explaining the context and giving or avoiding having more blind spots. But again, there's a big if about the availability of this kind of studies in different contexts and different countries.
Thank you so much, Anil and AR. The next question is from Lucy Wakiaga. The question is, how does your project operationally define the term TVET? Some countries have various TVET levels, for instance, vocational centers and technical and vocational colleges, etc. So which Lucy thinks impact engagement differently. So Lucy is curious if inclusion of these other definitions would alter or change our research approach.
I think I'd like to just touch on sort of this really interesting aspect of this sector where different terminologies are used in different ways. And then I think I might pass over to the FCDO team, because maybe, and this is really something that came up in a discussion in last week as well, technical and vocational education and skills, TVET, is a term that evolves. Maybe it's a term that was more common 10 years ago. Another term we have also been using is the learning to earning transition / pathway. But I think this really gets back to why, when we've been creating the framework, we've been trying to move away from terminology and focus more on components and activities. It's less important to us whether it was a college or a polytechnic or a private sector development organization that delivered the TVET program. It's more about, for us, what was delivered what was the setting. So it's not that we would exclude any of those. We're interested in all of it so long as the components that are making up the programs fit what we are looking to include in the framework. But there is an interesting discussion to be had here about what is the sort of correct term that we should be moving forward with. Is it learning to earning, or is it TVET? And I don't know if anybody has any thoughts on that at all.
Yes, Phoebe.
Yeah, thanks. I have some thoughts. I think learning to earning, I think, was a phrase that we stole from Generation Unlimited, who are one of our partners on our kind of main skills program at the moment, which is the Girls Education Skills Partnership, which is in Bangladesh and Nigeria. I think we like that phrase because, like, exactly for the reason that you outlined, Jem, TVET had become a little bit sticky for us. I think we'd also kind of had a few examples of TVET programs in the past that hadn't quite achieved their aims because they were so narrowly defined in terms of like one kind of job sector, one formal set of education, and kind of like it was quite rigid. And we were finding that, especially when the world of work was changing at a pace that TVET programming could not keep up. So by the time you've trained a generation of people to work in one sector, that sector's kind of moved on. So I personally prefer talking about skills and seeing TVET as a component of skills, because soft skills is something that we think that there's quite good evidence on, and also prepares if we're talking about the supply side, it prepares young people, especially, to navigate a really complex and changing employment landscape. So we focus a lot on kind of technical ability and kind of, like we talked about, the ability, job hunting, and the ability to kind of entrepreneurship. Those are all kind of really like growing areas for us that don't fall under the remit of formal TVET. Also, because I think FCDOs had a focus on women and girls and reaching the most marginalized, and often those people are outside of the formal education system. So if they haven't been through foundational education, if they haven't completed 12 years of foundational learning, for example, they're not necessarily going to get into a polytechnic or a technical college, but that doesn't mean that they can't be reached through some skills interventions and kind of gain employment through that afterwards, even if they haven't had that kind of foundational learning that we would argue for. So I think in terms of a definition, I would completely agree with Jem and say we need to kind of break it down and think about the individual components rather than getting too bogged down in TVET and a kind of systemized approach that only thinks about polytechnics. And we're actually talking about what happens inside of polytechnics, but also outside of the formal education system, just so that we can have that complementary focus on soft skills and also the kind of harder skills that we're talking about in traditional TVET. Thank you.
Thanks, Phoebe. All right, so we still have a couple of questions, so I'll just keep going through. So the next question is from Patience Kibadi. How adaptable is the proposed framework to faith-based or community-led interventions, such as those implemented by Compassion International?
So I think this goes back to exactly what we were talking about the question before, in that it's not for us whether it was sort of faith-based or community-led, so long as the intervention, the activities themselves fit within our framework, then it's something that we'd be interested in. In terms of how it's delivered, those are the sorts of variables that we want to capture as the cross-cutting themes, but I don't see why, so long as the activities are something we're interested in, that would be excluded. I don't see anything there.
Right. Thank you, Zam. The next question is from Veronica Kutix. The question is, what kind of indicators can be used when gathering evidence on whether the intervention in TVET leads to increased productivity of the TVET graduates after employment? I believe, Sam, you touched upon this in the presentation, but maybe you can give a bit of summary on this.
Yeah, I think this is a good question. Sort of, again, we'll be able to answer it in a lot more detail at the end of phase 2, when we can see what sorts of evidence is capturing this outcome. Off the top of my head, I would assume, though, that's something that could be captured within our outcome category called employee performance. And so one thing to say about these intervention outcome categories is we didn't pull them out of thin air. Obviously, we had lots of discussions like this, but we also done a scoping of about 100 different TVET evaluations to look at what is being implemented and what outcomes are being measured. So we know these outcomes are being measured, and we know that, and I believe off the top of my head, we did this a few months ago, there were at least a couple of papers that were looking at that as an outcome, measuring it based on an employee's performance, things like the quality of their work, however they might want to measure that, and the number of hours and days that somebody worked. So that is something that is being captured. Probably different studies and programs are capturing it in very different ways, but in general, as a category, it's something that we want to capture, and hopefully in phase 2, we'll be able to go into a lot more detail about what that actually looks like within specific studies.
Thank you, Sam. The next question is from Lankapoto Sudhakar Reddy. Lankapoto is wondering if any evidence exists that relates entrepreneurship promotion as the outcome of TVET interventions, or if it would be simply wage employment. And also, Lankapoto is wondering what sort of the findings are relating to the successful interventions focusing on entrepreneurship promotion and self-employment as the intervention outcome.
So I think I'll quickly cover this because I think it's quite related to the framework, like the last question. Again, I don't know whether there's much evidence yet because we haven't done the evidence mapping. That will be phase 2. But that is something that we want to look at. That is specifically why we created these 2 outcome groups, one which looks at business performance of those who engaged in TVET and one for the businesses who were providing the TVET. This would be captured under the businesses set up by people who went through an entrepreneurship program. And at the moment, we actually only have 2 specific outcome categories in there. One of them is very generally called business performance. Obviously, that is a purposeful act so that we can make sure it captures any sort of measurement around a business. So again, we don't know what the evidence there is yet. We know, though, it's in our framework, it is being captured in some studies. How it's being captured, unsure yet. It will probably be captured in a lot of different ways, but we will seek to answer this question, hopefully, from phase 2 to understand what sort of business performance measures there are for people going through entrepreneurship trainings.
Thanks. Yes, Phoebe.
Yeah, and I would just add to that. So definitely in terms of, from our perspective, we do want to focus on far more than just kind of traditional TVET interventions. So entrepreneurship is something that we're really interested in. We're currently funding under our current program, and we're keen to generate evidence for this as well as kind of find what the existing evidence is. So we should have some good results coming out from that in the next couple of years.
Thank you so much. I think before we wrap it up, maybe we can just touch the last comment from the chat. Charlotte Bayer from Oxfam. I'll just read it out, and I think it's a comment or feedback rather than a question, but maybe we can go through this and then you can share your reflections. So Charlotte Bayer says, building on the point from before on fragile and conflict-affected countries, it would be relevant to keep an eye on the internal inequalities in the system and to which extent the stronger TVET schools can support the ones needing more capacity. And another point was likewise, it would be interesting to look at rich TVET as well and how well this works, an approach sometimes used to make TVET more accessible in hard to reach areas. also interesting to look at effective strategies to engage or support the dialogue between private sector and TVET. Any reflections?
I can start quickly. Just on the second point about TVET's accessibility in hard to reach areas. One, and obviously hard to reach could be for a lot of reasons, but just one of the things we have been thinking about for this framework is that we know in a lot of rural areas there can be divides around this, and there are lots of efforts to try and bridge that gap. This was a really complicated one for us in terms of how do we incorporate this into the framework. And so we have a outcome group around accessibility and breaking down these barriers, but the rural aspect didn't really seem to fit there because it was normally combined in how an intervention was implemented. So for us, at least, I think we'll definitely capture that in the cross-cutting themes is the intervention targeting rural areas. So I think we should be able to capture that. I don't know if anybody has any other reflections on the other 2 points.
Yeah, I do. Thanks, Jem, and thanks, Charlotte. Great questions. Yeah, certainly on the first point about inequalities in the system, it's definitely for fragile and conflict affected country. This will be something that we'll want to look at, and we'll kind of need to think about how we reflect that, as it's it's not work that we've done so much in the past. On private sector, this one is particularly important from my perspective, because we already know, the evidence has already told us that kind of TVET and skills interventions without buy-in from the private sector and without co-creation with industry is less effective than those interventions where you do have co-creation and you do have buy-in from the private sector. So we should absolutely be seeking to capture that in future phases of this work. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And if we have a minute, I'd just like to touch the question that just freshly came in. So this will be the last question from Dennis Ronald. If we consider time dimension of TVET interventions in terms of impact, this might be, it's better addressed by Zen. Yeah.
So yeah, this is something that's come up in a lot of discussions. Are there differing impacts between short-term or long-term programs? Absolutely something that we will capture as a cross-cutting theme. Still work to be done though. Short-term, long-term, what does that actually mean? How do you put a length to that? So that's something that will definitely be evolving, and we'll definitely have to do a deep dive into the sector to understand, is 6 months short-term, is 2 years long-term. It will be different in different contexts as well, but absolutely something that we will look to capture. AR?
Yeah, very quickly, I was discussing today in a movie with a group of participants in our training here that we have this challenge of having not enough long-term impact evaluation, right? So even like absolutely we can think about looking into like 1 year, 2 years, but when we would like to go beyond or like thinking about long-term impact, on a global level, there's a very rare number of impact evaluation where they conducted long-term impact evaluation. This is for many reasons. One of them that is the incentive is not there. Incentive for researchers, incentives for even grant makers for funding this kind of research. So that's why this actually led to having long impact evaluations that usually do not collect data on a longer term, right? So again, this is a question we can discuss later, but I do expect that we'll have, even if we decide to look into like long-term impact evaluations, this will be very, very, very challenging, given the very little or a few number of evaluations that looked into this.
Thank you so much. I believe that's it from the Q&A. So yeah.
Perfect. Thank you very much for that, Sarah. I think, yeah, that ran really smoothly. And thank you to everybody who has asked a question and commented in the chat. I actually noticed in the chat a lot of people have directly responded to those questions we had on the PowerPoint about what is important in different contexts. And so we can take a look through all of those to make sure that it is encapsulated in the framework. And again, really wonderful to see so much engagement in this sector. I don't know if I've done work like this in a sector where people are so willing to engage and help and support one another. And I think there are some follow-ups in there. So a lot of people have been asking for the recording or the PowerPoint. We're going to be following up tomorrow. We will share the recording there. Also be able then to contact us if you do have any follow-up questions or anything you would like to add. I think that's about everything from me. I will open the floor if anybody on the panel wants to say anything.
Quickly, I would say thank you all for staying that long. Super intense question, extremely valuable. We can't thank you enough for all your contribution. Also encouraging everyone, in case I got this comment, I read this several times, that people would like to contribute, to share evidence, share articles or papers. Please feel free to do this. We really appreciate this, and this will absolutely reach our ability to capture the entire evidence on a global level. So thank you so much, everyone.
Thanks, Aya. Thanks, Jem. And just to add from our side, FCDO is really appreciative of everyone who's engaged on this work so far, and also especially to 3IE for leading this work. We had a question at the beginning of the year about how we were going to take our next steps on skills forward, and it feels like we found a really good approach, and lots of work has gone into this scoping study and framework. So thank you all, and thanks to Nikki and Marie for opening the session as well.